Welcome to the Trackpads Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The morning of January 14, 1969, began like countless others for the men aboard the USS Enterprise. She was steaming near Hawaii, her decks alive with energy, preparing for a new round of flight operations. The carrier was a marvel of engineering, the first nuclear-powered ship of her kind, and a symbol of American naval dominance. To those who worked her flight deck, the rhythm of jet engines, the smell of aviation fuel, and the sight of men in colored jerseys directing aircraft were part of daily life. Yet just beneath that surface of routine, danger lurked, invisible but ever-present. Few could imagine that within minutes the ship would face its greatest trial, not against an enemy fleet, but against fire itself. The flight deck on that January morning was crowded with aircraft, weapons, and men moving in well-practiced choreography. Pilots ran through their checks. Yellow shirt directors signaled with precision, and ordnance crews readied rockets and bombs for training sorties. The noise was deafening, the tempo relentless, but to the sailors it was simply another day at sea. The Enterprise had seen deployments, she had carried American air power across the globe, and she seemed untouchable. What the crew could not see was the flaw waiting among the weapons on deck. A single rocket misaligned, poised to turn routine into catastrophe. That morning's calm was deceptive, because in truth, the flight deck was always a battlefield. The hazards of fuel, explosives, and machinery made it one of the most dangerous places in the world to work. Every man on deck knew it, yet routine bred confidence, and confidence dulled the edge of caution. The Navy had already endured tragedies aboard the Forrestal and the Oriskany, but lessons had been only partly absorbed. The Enterprise represented progress, yet she carried the same vulnerabilities beneath her impressive size and power. The smallest mistake could ignite a chain reaction, and on this morning, it would. The story of the 1969 fire on the Enterprise is more than an account of disaster. It is a study in survival, leadership, and transformation. The flames that swept across her deck claimed lives and destroyed machines, but they also forged changes that reshaped naval aviation forever. The men who fought that day stood not only against fire but against the collapse of their ship, and in saving her, they changed the Navy. Their ordeal was carved into steel, doctrine, and memory, ensuring that every carrier crew since has carried their lessons. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier was often called the most dangerous 4.5 acres in the world, and in January 1969, the USS Enterprise proved why. From bow to stern, the deck was a living geography of hazards. 4 catapults launched aircraft with staggering force, while at the stern arresting gear brought them crashing back in violent stops. The island superstructure jetted upward like a skyscraper, overseeing an industrial plain of steel, aircraft, and men. Elevators pumped planes and ordnance between the hangar and the deck above, creating constant movement in every direction. Non-skid coatings kept boots from sliding, but the surface itself burned hot under Pacific sun or turned slick with fuel spills. Everything about this environment was raw energy compressed into a narrow space. It was designed for efficiency, but in that efficiency lay vulnerability. One mistake, one overlooked detail, could ripple into disaster. Tempo defined the deck's heartbeat. Jets prepared for launch in tight choreography, engines screaming while others taxied or returned from the sky. Colored jerseys distinguished roles, and each color carried life-or-death responsibilities. Yellow shirts directed aircraft like traffic officers in a storm, arms cutting signals through jet blast. Red shirts tended bombs, rockets, and napalm, positioning weapons with precision. Purple grapes fueled aircraft, dragging hoses across steel slick with hydraulic fluid and salt spray. Green shirts manned the catapults, the arresting gear, and the mechanical veins that allowed flight to exist. White shirts, safety observers, and medics scanned the chaos for errors before they metastasized. Every man's contribution was essential, every gesture calibrated against noise and danger. To the untrained eye, it looked like madness. To those who lived it, it was controlled violence, an endless rhythm that left little room for hesitation. Danger lurked in every corner, often in forms invisible until too late. Jet blast could pick a man up and hurl him across the deck. Propellers or intake fans could suck in the unwary, leaving no chance of rescue. Ordnance, armed and staged for sorties, waited quietly but dangerously close to flowing streams of jet fuel. Flames could spread before anyone even realized a hose had ruptured or a connection had failed. Add to this the noise, a constant assault that reduced communication to shouts, signals, or sheer guesswork. The crew worked with the knowledge that the smallest failure, an unfastened clamp, a misaligned weapon, a spark at the wrong moment, could unleash disaster. And yet they pressed on, because such risk was part of their trade. To work the flight deck was to accept the possibility of fire, explosion, or death every single day. Yet there was beauty in the chaos. The young sailors who manned that deck were, for the most part, barely out of high school, but they moved with the discipline of veterans. They accepted danger without bravado, trusting each other's hands and signals more than their own eyes. Jets roared into the sky on schedule, weapons loaded and missions executed, because their choreography made the impossible look routine. The flight deck was a marvel of coordination, where technology and human grit fused into combat power. But its very strength was also its greatest weakness. Packing so much energy, machinery, and ordnance into such a small space meant that if the balance tipped even slightly, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Enterprise, despite her nuclear power and modern systems, carried that fragility with her. On January 14th, the fragile equilibrium of that deck would finally shatter. The Zuni rocket was a relatively small piece of ordnance, but on a crowded carrier deck, size mattered less than placement. Designed as an air-to-ground weapon, the Zuni was mounted beneath the wings of jets and clusters, a routine loadout even on training days. On January 14, 1969, one such rocket was misaligned, its connection not properly seated, its launch rail vulnerable to vibration and heat. To sailors accustomed to handling far more destructive bombs, it may have seemed a minor concern, one among thousands of details managed each cycle. But that morning, as aircraft engines roared and exhaust poured across the deck, the flaw became the perfect trigger. A spark wasn't necessary. The heat and turbulence of jet blast were enough. The Zuni suddenly launched, not against a target range, but across the deck of the Enterprise, slamming into a parked jet and tearing open its fuel tank. The instant result was fire, a roaring column of burning jet fuel spewing across steel. Flames raced outward in seconds, feeding on vapors and igniting whatever they touched. Sailors who had been waving aircraft into position froze for a heartbeat, staring at the eruption, before training snapped them into motion. But training, however rigorous, could not fully prepare anyone for such a moment. The Zuni's impact had transformed the deck from a work site into a battlefield. Jets fueled and armed for launch became hazards in waiting. Weapons loaded onto wings or staged nearby began to cook in the rising heat. The first seconds of flame were manageable, at least in theory, but the pace of disaster outstripped the crew's ability to react. Within a minute, what had started as a single rocket misfire had mushroomed into an inferno threatening the entire carrier. For the men on deck, the violence was immediate and indiscriminate. Some were thrown by the concussion of the rocket's strike. Others engulfed in burning fuel. Black smoke boiled upward, reducing visibility to feet. The roar of engines gave way to the deeper, more terrifying sound of explosions, each one signaling another piece of ordnance giving way to heat. Shrapnel cut through aluminum and flesh, scything across the deck with deadly speed. Sailors scrambled to grab hoses, only to be driven back by blast and flame. Others crawled through smoke, dragging wounded comrades to the edge of the inferno. The disciplined ballet of pre-flight checks had disintegrated in less than 2 minutes, leaving behind a scene that felt more like combat under attack than routine operations. The chain of destruction had only just begun. What made the moment so devastating was its speed. Disasters on land often unfold with some measure of warning, a smell of smoke, a flicker of flame, but on a carrier deck, disaster erupts fully formed. The misfired rocket had not only destroyed a jet, but ruptured a tank of volatile JP-5 fuel, spraying accelerant across an area packed with men and weapons. Each second allowed the fire to leap outward, multiplying into new threats. Jets parked wingtip to wingtip became obstacles, trapping men in corridors of flame. Every piece of ordnance was a potential grenade, its timing measured in seconds as temperatures spiked. In that environment, hesitation was death, and yet hesitation was inevitable as human minds struggled to process chaos. By the time the first hose crews advanced, the enemy was no longer a single fire, but a chain reaction that threatened to consume the ship. The first burst of flame from the Zuni strike was only the opening note in a brutal symphony of destruction. As the jet fuel burned hotter, it spread across seams in the deck and ignited other aircraft staged nearby. Within moments, the fire reached munitions strapped under wings, bombs, rockets, and napalm canisters primed for training runs. These weapons, never meant to be exposed to uncontrolled heat, began to cook off in terrifying succession. A dull thump would erupt into a concussive blast, shredding aircraft into molten fragments and hurling shrapnel across the deck. Each explosion created new fires, which in turn triggered more detonations. What had begun as a single rocket accident became a runaway chain reaction, a battlefield on steel, with no enemy in sight except fire itself. The effects on men were immediate and horrifying. Shrapnel pierced flesh, jet blast hurled bodies, and fire consumed those unlucky enough to be caught in its path. Survivors staggered through smoke, ears ringing from explosions, eyes watering against burning fumes. The sensory overload was almost paralyzing. The deafening roar of blasts, the searing heat radiating from multiple fire points, and the choking blackness that reduced visibility to a few feet. In such conditions, even finding a fire hose or a clear path to safety became a monumental task. Yet amid the chaos, sailors began to rally, driven not by orders but by instinct and the need to save their shipmates. Aircraft themselves became weapons against their own crew. One jet after another collapsed under the heat, its aluminum frame sagging until tanks ruptured, releasing more fuel to the flames. Rockets cooked off unpredictably, streaking across the deck like wild arrows, ricocheting off steel and disappearing into clouds of smoke before detonating. Napalm canisters burst, spilling sticky fire that clung to everything it touched, creating pools of flame nearly impossible to extinguish. The deck was no longer simply burning. It was erupting in violent spasms, each detonation reshaping the battlefield, leaving men disoriented and scrambling to adapt. To stand and fight in such conditions required a resolve few could summon, yet many did, advancing into heat that felt unbearable. Below decks, the danger loomed just as large. Flames licked dangerously close to the ship's elevators, threatening to spread the inferno into hangar bays packed with fuel and ordnance. Reports, filtering into Damage Control Central, suggested the possibility of magazine detonations, a nightmare scenario that could destroy the ship outright. Leaders understood they were racing against time. Every explosion above increased the chance of catastrophe below. Flooding compartments, isolating fuel lines, and sealing hatches became urgent priorities. But the truth was simple. The ship's survival depended on the men fighting topside. If the fire advanced unchecked across the deck, no amount of compartmentation could save the Enterprise. In those moments, the carrier stood on the razor's edge between survival and annihilation. From the tower of Pryfly, the air boss and his staff watched helplessly as smoke boiled upward, obscuring large portions of the flight deck. At first, it was easy to believe the fire could be contained. After all, the Navy trained constantly for deck fires, and Enterprise carried modern systems and experienced crews. Yet within moments it was clear this was no routine blaze. Ordnance detonated unpredictably, creating flashes and concussions that shook the island tower itself. Reports over radios came fragmented. Explosion forward. Casualties near Catapult 3. Ordnance cooking off. But no single voice could provide the whole picture. The air boss faced impossible questions in real time. Should returning aircraft be diverted elsewhere? Should deck crews keep attempting to launch fighters to clear the deck, Or was it already too dangerous? Every order carried consequences measured not in procedure, but in lives. Leadership in those first minutes meant gambling with incomplete knowledge, trying to outpace chaos as it spread across the ship. Below decks, Damage Control Central wrestled with its own dilemmas. Officers received a torrent of contradictory information about which compartments were compromised, which fuel lines had been isolated, and whether the flames were threatening the magazines. The nuclear heart of the carrier, the reactors buried deep within her hull, remained secure for the moment. But if fires penetrated key compartments, even that might be at risk. Flooding decisions had to be made on the spot. Too much water in the wrong places would sink the carrier by her own crew's hand. Too little, and fire would take the choice away. Orders were relayed to seal off boundaries, activate fire mains, and pump foam into threatened spaces. The officers knew that they were, in many respects, fighting blind. Yet hesitation was deadly, and so they acted with conviction, hoping their gambles would preserve the ship long enough for the deck teams to wrestle the blaze under control. On the deck itself, authority did not flow from tower or central command so much as it emerged from whoever could steady frightened men. Chiefs and petty officers took charge instinctively, dividing wreckage-strewn spaces into firefighting sectors. One petty officer rallied men to manhoses, advancing line by line against the flames. Another organized the dragging of wounded to safer zones, establishing improvised casualty collection points amid the chaos. These leaders were not issuing carefully considered directives. They were shouting over explosions, pointing through smoke, and sometimes physically pushing men into position. What mattered was presence, not rank insignia. Sailors, many of them barely 20 years old, responded to whoever moved with purpose and confidence. On that day, leadership was proven less by the stripes on a sleeve than by the willingness to step into the flames and show others the way forward. For the Ordnance crews, the choices were brutal and immediate. Weapons that had been prepped for launches were now glowing with dangerous heat, seconds away from detonating. Clearing them meant stepping directly into the inferno, often without the protection of firefighting gear, to shove or drag explosives toward the deck edge. Some used tractors, hooking chains and straining machinery to haul bombs across warped steel. Others did it by hand, wrapping rags around blistering casings and heaving with desperate strength. Each successful jettison bought the crew precious seconds, preventing another chain reaction that could rip the carrier apart. The men knew exactly what they risked. Many had seen comrades already torn apart by earlier blasts. And yet, they went anyway, driven by the simple knowledge that if they didn't, the ship and everyone aboard would be lost. Their courage did not come with medals in that moment. It came with scorched hands, shattered nerves, and the unrelenting will to act. Communication across the deck fractured almost immediately. Radios shorted out, wires burned, and the roar of fire drowned even the loudest voices. Orders that would normally cascade through headsets and intercoms now depended on hand gestures, shouts, or instinct. A raised fist meant hold. A forward wave meant advance. In some cases, men simply copied the actions of those nearest them, dragging hoses into the smoke because someone else did. Amid the breakdown, clarity became the rarest and most valuable resource. The sailors who acted decisively, who gestured with conviction or strode toward the fire without hesitation, became rallying points. Leadership in those moments was stripped of ceremony and hierarchy. It was nothing more and nothing less than motion. Authority belonged to the man who stepped into the blaze, and on the deck of Enterprise, many did just that. Crash and salvage crews surged forward into a battlefield of flame, their mission clear. Keep the fire from spreading and save the ship. They dragged heavy hoses across twisted steel and burning wreckage, advancing under a curtain of smoke so thick it turned the world into shifting shadows. Foam nozzles hissed to life, spraying white blankets of aqueous film-forming foam over rivers of burning fuel. Water fog patterns cooled ordnance, buying precious seconds before bombs and rockets cooked off in the searing heat. Yet every tactic came with danger. Foam reduced visibility, leaving sailors blind to explosions erupting only feet away. Water added weight to the deck, threatening to flood already weakened surfaces. and each advance demanded men push deeper into areas where the temperature could blister skin through clothing. Still, they pressed forward, inch by inch, fighting an enemy that multiplied faster than they could contain. Their persistence turned chaos into something resembling a plan. Where hoses could not succeed, muscle and machinery carried the day. Tractors roared into the inferno, their operators half blinded, towing crippled aircraft to the edge of the deck and shoving them overboard. Sailors wrapped rags around their hands to seize burning debris, hauling twisted metal clear to prevent new fires from sparking. The heat warped aircraft frames, turning once proud jets into sagging carcasses of aluminum, yet the men treated them as obstacles to be cleared, not machines to be saved. In many cases, bombs still hung beneath wings, glowing in the firelight. Chains were rigged, tractors strained, and sailors shoved with sheer determination until those deadly packages were dumped into the sea. Each one gone meant one less chance for another catastrophic blast. It was brutal work, carried out under the constant percussion of detonations, but it gave the crew breathing space to continue the fight. Meanwhile, medical teams transformed passageways and corners of the ship into improvised triage centers. Sailors blackened with smoke stumbled down ladders, dragging wounded comrades whose burns and lacerations spoke to the violence of the deck. Sickbay filled quickly, its beds and floors occupied by the injured, while corpsmen worked tirelessly, improvising bandages from whatever was at hand. Stretchers moved in grim procession, carrying men from deck to elevators, then down to waiting helicopters that whisked the most critical ashore. The cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of explosions, and still the triage lines held, staffed by corpsmen and doctors who worked with steady hands, despite exhaustion. For those still topside, the sight of wounded being carried away underscored the stakes. They were fighting not just for the ship's survival, but for the men who could not save themselves. Personal acts of courage emerged everywhere, often unrecorded and unsung. A sailor who should have retreated advanced instead, dragging a hose into flames while his skin blistered. Another, seeing a bomb glowing red with heat, threw himself forward to help heave it overboard, knowing it might detonate in his grasp. Men pushed through smoke to answer the faint cries of comrades pinned beneath wreckage, lifting twisted steel with raw strength. These were not extraordinary men by nature. They were ordinary sailors confronted with extraordinary circumstances. What bound them together was instinct and loyalty, a refusal to let fear dictate their actions. Their names might never fill citations or memorials, but their actions bought the ship minutes, and those minutes saved thousands. It was courage measured not in recognition, but in sweat, burns, and stubborn willpower. Slowly, after hours of grinding combat against the flames, momentum shifted. The inferno still raged, but the chain of detonations slowed, the rhythm of destruction no longer dictating every heartbeat on deck. Hose crews began to hold their ground. Salvage teams pushed wreckage aside and cleared lanes of advance. The deck itself, once an erupting plain of fire, became a patchwork of smoking craters and scattered pools of fuel, still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. Exhausted sailors collapsed where they stood, only to rise again when another flare threatened to undo their progress. By nightfall, the Enterprise remained afloat, battered and scarred, but alive. Her nuclear heart was untouched, her hull unbroken, and her crew bloodied, burned, and forever changed, had won a battle as fierce as any fought against a foreign enemy. In the days and weeks after the flames were finally extinguished, the Navy turned to the painful work of understanding what had happened and why. Investigators combed through the charred remains of aircraft, scorched deck plating, and blackened ordnance casings. They pieced together the sequence of events: the misfired Zuni rocket, the ruptured fuel tank, the cascading explosions, and confronted the vulnerabilities that had made the fire so devastating. The conclusions were sobering. Procedures for ordnance handling had been followed, but they were insufficient. Safety checks had not anticipated the misalignment of a launch rail, nor the deadly combination of heat and jet blast. The lesson was stark. Routine procedures were not enough. The Navy had to reform its entire approach to weapons handling on carriers. Safety could no longer rely on luck or assumption. It had to be engineered into every step. The reforms began with Ordnance itself. Zuni rockets, once treated as relatively low-risk items, were subjected to new standards of alignment, storage, and mounting. Thermal shielding was mandated for munitions exposed on the deck, ensuring that bombs and rockets could endure longer under extreme heat before detonating. Procedures governing how aircraft were spotted, where they were parked, how weapons were arranged, were rewritten to prevent one explosion from setting off another in rapid sequence. Crews received stricter protocols for safe arming and disarming, and weapons no longer sat clustered in ways that multiplied danger. These changes reflected the reality the Enterprise fire had revealed. The flight deck was too tightly packed with hazards for any margin of error. The rules had to bend toward survival, even if it slowed operations. Equipment was also transformed. Firefighting systems were overhauled with increased foam capacity and redundancy, ensuring no single hit could disable an entire section of response gear. Pumps were upgraded, hoses reinforced, and quick disconnect fittings installed so that damaged fuel lines could be isolated in seconds. Even the deck surface was reconsidered. New non-skid coatings were selected for both grip and heat resistance, designed to resist blistering and peeling under fire. Salvage tractors received additional armor, giving their operators a fighting chance to survive when pushing into burning wreckage. Every component was scrutinized through the lens of January 1969, and every improvement carried the memory of the sailors who had fought amid fire and smoke. The scars of the Enterprise were written into the steel of the next generation of carriers. But perhaps the most profound change came in the realm of training. Before the fire, damage control and firefighting were often treated as collateral duties necessary, but not the central mission of aviation crews. After the disaster, the Navy redefined that culture. Firefighting became a core competency, drilled into every sailor until response was instinctive. Training schools added live fire simulations, complete with exploding ordnance and fuel-fed blazes, so that crews would face in practice the chaos they might encounter in reality. Drills were no longer box-check exercises. They were rehearsals for survival. Aggressive tactics laying foam blankets quickly, advancing hose teams under heat, improvising salvage operations, were institutionalized into doctrine. From the ashes of Enterprise, the Navy forged a culture that treated damage control not as a contingency but as a way of life. Doctrine and design followed suit. NATOP's manuals incorporated detailed lessons from the disaster, spreading the knowledge fleet-wide. Carrier layouts were altered to create greater separation between hazardous areas, minimizing the chance that one explosion would ignite a chain reaction. Magazines received additional protection, and ordnance staging practices were refined. These changes extended beyond the Enterprise, shaping every carrier that followed. The 1969 fire became part of a broader lineage of hard-earned lessons, joining the earlier tragedies of the Forrestal and the Oriskany. Together, they formed a canon of memory that ensured the Navy's procedures were written not in abstract theory, but in the blood and sacrifice of its sailors. The price of readiness was acknowledged as eternal vigilance, and vigilance was embedded into every new page of doctrine. Most enduring of all was the recognition that memory itself had to be codified into policy. The Enterprise fire was not treated as an isolated incident, but as a living warning. Photographs of the burning deck, films of the explosions, and reports of the dead and wounded became instructional tools. New sailors arriving on carriers heard the story not as distant history, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that their work sat balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The names of the fallen were invoked in classrooms and training halls, their sacrifice honored by ensuring their fate would not be repeated. In this way, the disaster transcended its moment, becoming part of the cultural DNA of naval aviation. Every time a hose was tested, every ordnance check performed, every drill conducted with seriousness, the spirit of January 14, 1969, lived on. When the last flames were extinguished and the smoke finally thinned into the Pacific sky, the USS Enterprise stood battered but afloat. Her flight deck was cratered and blackened, littered with the wreckage of destroyed aircraft and the remnants of exploded ordnance. The smell of burned fuel and scorched steel clung to every surface. For the men who had fought through that day, the physical scars of the ship mirrored the wounds etched into their memories. They recalled comrades carried away on stretchers, the deafening rhythm of explosions, and the heat that turned steel decks into furnaces beneath their boots. Survival had come at a terrible cost: scores dead, many more wounded. But the carrier herself remained intact. The nuclear reactors deep within her hull never faltered, a testament to the courage and determination of the crew who refused to abandon their ship to the flames. The Navy, confronted with the human toll and the staggering destruction, moved swiftly to honor the sacrifice by ensuring the lessons were never forgotten. The Enterprise fire was studied with a seriousness equal to that of a combat defeat. It revealed that courage alone was not enough. Discipline, training, and doctrine had to evolve if future crews were to fare better. Out of the tragedy came a renewed commitment to damage control, ordnance safety, and the resilience of carrier operations. Policies were rewritten, equipment redesigned, and training intensified, all under the shadow of January 14th. The men who had died were not simply mourned, they became the guardians of future sailors, their memory enshrined in every new safety measure. For the generations of sailors who came after, the Enterprise fire served as both warning and inspiration. The story was retold in classrooms, during drills, and in the quiet conversations of veterans passing knowledge to recruits. It became part of the Navy's living tradition, teaching that a carrier is only as strong as the vigilance of her crew. Fire was not an abstract possibility, but a predator waiting for opportunity, and only discipline and unity could keep it at bay. At the same time, the actions of those who fought the inferno offered a model of bravery. Ordinary sailors who, without hesitation, advanced into smoke and heat to save their shipmates and their ship. Their heroism stood as proof that even in the darkest hours, leadership and loyalty could tip the balance toward survival. Today, when modern carriers operate with technologies undreamed of in 1969, the echoes of Enterprise remain. Every foam nozzle, every ordnance protocol, every damage control drill carries within it the lessons purchased on that deck. The ship herself would go on to serve for decades more, a survivor scarred but unbowed, her story woven into the identity of the Navy she served. The fire was not the end of her story, but a defining chapter one that transformed her from a nuclear marvel into a teacher whose legacy guards sailors to this day. The ordeal of January 14th remains a stark reminder. The price of readiness is eternal vigilance, and the courage of sailors in the face of fire ensures that vigilance endures.
Thank you for joining us on the Trackpads Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.